I'd also like to acknowledge that we're meeting on Aboriginal land and pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and elders past and present. This is a talk that I am thrilled to give because I am really excited about this information, and I'm also excited about the topic because we gathered as a group at the Ministry of Health to say, well, this great title, brain science, what can we say underneath other than child and family health or some long thing? And so we've said making connections for the future. And I hope when you see the end of this talk, I'm not just talking about the brain of the individual child making connections for the future, but what can we do in this room as representatives, as advocates, by the fact that you've come here and want to hear this information to make connections for the future of children and families in New South Wales. So I have 20 minutes, and so we're going to cover neuroanatomy, biochemistry, epigenetics, go ahead, and I'm going to begin and end with policy. Okay, we're all good? Yeah. Right. Okay, so it's an easy ask. All right, so I want to begin with some work that I was involved with in 1992. Now, I know, looking at my obvious youth, you wonder how I could have been involved in 1992. I was the child representative, I was the consumer. Okay, so at that time we were looking at some national policy work. In those days we talked about health goals and targets. And I want you to look at the one in red, to make it easy, and that was to reduce the impact of conditions occurring in adulthood which have their origins in childhood or adolescence. We thought we were so clever even thinking about a concept that there could be an adult disease that had its origin in childhood or adolescence. Of course, we were thinking about things like sun exposure and sunburn causing melanoma, nothing like the explosion of what happened. And in fact, now I would put it out to you and challenge that I cannot think of an adult disease that doesn't have its origin in preconception, pregnancy, or the early years. So that's how wrong we got it in 1992. I love saying to medical students as they graduate that half of what we've taught them in the course is wrong. The only problem is we don't know which half. And so similarly, this is what's happened in this period of time, that we've had a real putting on our heads as to what happens in childhood and the impact of that in adulthood. So speaking of the evidence, this just gives you a little bit of the impact of and these major reports, and the beauty of what's happened in the evidence on early brain development is governments have picked it up and made policy changes as a result of it. And that's been a really exciting time to be involved in policy, where you're actually getting science translating into changes in practice. And that indeed is what we've done in New South Wales in the health system, and I'll show you a few details about that as we go through. But this just gives you an overview of some of the titles of other nations' work, from neurons to neighbourhood, to early years study, reversing the real brain drain, things like that. Okay, here's the head circumference chart. As a young doctor, I would always take the head circumference after I'd done the height and weight of any child that I admitted to hospital, never thinking about what was happening inside the head. I think I just thought the brain grew. You know, I just thought that that's what it did. There was the genetic potential of what the parents' heads were and the brains inside the heads, and I didn't really think about the importance of that. I didn't even notice the graph. If you had a look at that graph, is there anyone here who did high-level maths at the high school certificate? Some of our young consumers. Okay. Is there anything you can do to describe that graph?
Pressure?
Bit of pressure.
Bit of pressure. Well, it's sort of reverse exponential, isn't it? It's rapid growth early on.
That's all I wanted you to say.
Because you know my next thing is going to be before birth, it's actually even more steeper.
Okay, so there's a really steep bit. Okay, the really steep bit is in the first year, and that's because the brain is growing so rapidly in the first year. And this is my beautiful slide. And have any of you had the experience of just lying out in rural New South Wales and looking at the stars and thinking, I cannot count the number of stars, right? Just that overwhelming experience. That's the number of neurons that a baby has when they're born. The only trouble is none of them connected. And that's the connection that we're going to talk about that's really important. So babies are born with 25% of their brains developed, and then there's this really rapid period of development, as we saw in the head circumference chart, so that by the age of 3, their brains are 80% developed for life. That's when it's happening, 0 to 3. So I just wanted to show this little clip from Harvard. It's 1 minute and 57 seconds, but I think it shows in 3D what I couldn't explain with some flat slides. So let's just have a look at this really exciting little video.
A child's experiences during the earliest years of life have a lasting impact on the architecture of the developing brain. Genes provide the basic blueprint, but experiences shape the process that determines whether a child's brain will provide a strong or weak foundation for all future learning, behavior, and health.
This is my favourite bit.
During this important period of brain development, billions of brain cells called neurons send electrical signals to communicate with each other. These connections form circuits that become the basic foundation of brain architecture. Circuits and connections proliferate at a rapid pace and are reinforced through repeated use. Our experiences and environment dictate which circuits and connections get more use. Connections that are used more grow stronger and more permanent. Meanwhile, connections that are used less fade away through a normal process called pruning. Well-used circuits create lightning-fast pathways for neural signals to travel across regions of the brain. Simple circuits form first, providing a foundation for more complex circuits to build on later. Through this process, neurons form strong circuits and connections for emotions, motor skills, behavioral control, logic, language, and memory during the early critical period of development. With repeated use, these circuits become more efficient and connect to other areas of the brain more rapidly. While they originate in specific areas of the brain, the circuits are interconnected. You can't have one type of skill without the others to support it. Like building a house, everything is connected, and what comes first forms a foundation for all that comes later.
So I think that just shows beautifully this architecture and the process of the brain development, and in particular, as we mentioned earlier, that first 3 years as to how rapidly that is happening. So then, at the same time as us getting PET scans and machines that could take pictures of the brain, regrettably, the Romanian orphans were being discovered by the Western world, and I say regrettably because these little children in a way have been the human experiment that we would not have been able to do. So these children were adopted to Western countries, to Canada and the UK, etc. And we've been able to follow these children and find out about critical window periods as to the timing of when they were adopted, as to when they were able to develop and to have opportunities for a normal life, or not the opportunities to live, love and learn. And at the same time, Bruce Perry has done some amazing work in the Trauma Institute and looking at the effect of extreme adversity on brain development. And as you can see with these PET scans, that some of that architecture that we were looking at in the previous video, these children just did not develop it. And the reason why is because there are critical window periods, but the development of the brain connection is dependent on stimulation. It's dependent on the experience that the child gets. To try and explain it simply, if we look at the first one there, vision. If a child is born with a cataract in one eye, then that brain doesn't develop the visual cortex level, doesn't develop the ability to see because there's a block and the light doesn't come through. And so if you remove the cataract later on, because there was that critical window period as to when the brain needed to form those pathways, that child will not ever get good vision from that eye. Whereas, you know, if you have a cataract removed later on in life, it makes no difference. You get your vision back because the cortical pathway in the brain has developed. That's why part of a newborn screen is that we check that the baby doesn't have cataracts, so that there is that opportunity for the brain to develop. Similarly, when we brought in newborn hearing screening in New South Wales, the SWISH screen, we were able to find out at birth whether that child was able to develop the pathways for communication, so that we could put in aids for them to hear, so that they could develop the brain, so that they could learn how to communicate. So these are the basic senses. But of course, there's also more important things like the response of a primary caregiver to the child developing great big loving tracts as to this is what my expectation is in life, as opposed to fear tracks, and that's where everything is a flight and fight response. So we're moving off the architecture to move now to the biochemistry. So this is new work that's come about that's looking at the stress hormones, and if you like, the way a baby can get set. We all need some stress, or otherwise you can't give talks like this. So we can say it's a little bit of a positive experience. So I've got a bit of an increase in heart rate, an elevation in my stress hormone level. Then there's tolerable. So if one of you asks a question, I'll get a serious and temporary stress response, but I'll be buffered by supportive relationships here on the left-hand side. However, if you ask a really difficult question and my colleagues have walked out the door, I can get a toxic response, which is prolonged activation, don't you dare, of the stress response. And of course, if you are talking about babies living in a domestic violence or an extreme stress environment, then they can be left at this toxic level. Now this has been studied, and there's an amazing study, and I suggest that you look up further, a prospective study, longitudinal study in Western Australia, the RAIN study, looking at the impacts of stress in utero, so on the effects of the baby in utero, and some amazing results coming out. Judge, where you can predict with the level of stress the mother may have about adolescent risk-taking behaviour. So, you know, these connections are just incredible. This is our own country, Western Australia, it's doing this amazing research. So have a look at that, it's worthwhile looking at further. The one that's probably more readily known is the work by Vincent Folletti, who was an adult physician who started looking at some of his patients who were having adult problems and started looking backwards, and came to a set of questions looking at adverse childhood experiences. And basically, if you have a look at some of these graphs, you can see that the number of experiences, adverse experiences that a child can have, can tip them so that it will predict disease, but it can also predict an earlier death. So what we're talking about is not just things that have an impact in childhood, but have an impact in adulthood, even to an earlier mortality. And when I was saying this work to a colleague of mine who's a GP, he said that it explained many patients who would have exactly the same kinds of illness, but one group would die earlier than another group. And he was looking back and could see that this toxic stress, and we're talking about toxic stress in childhood, leading to an impact later on in life. Now, these are all epidemiological studies. They don't actually describe the biology, the mechanism of how these things are happening. And this we're now beginning to understand in the field of epigenetics. And so this is about experiences altering how genes are expressed and what that can mean for adult health, and also indeed what can be transferred to the next generation. At the tip of a gene is a telomere, and if a telomere is shortened, that can also lead to increase in mortality and a shortened life. And this is the kind of mechanism that we think is influencing what ultimately can happen for adult disease. if a child has been subject to toxic stress. Now, I think this is an amazing concept that we really need to understand, that the grandmother's pregnancy is not just affecting the child in utero, but her grandchild, because indeed the eggs that may someday become the grandchild are developed inside the daughter while she's still in the womb with the mother. So the importance of what we're talking about is not just about children. It's not just about a 3-year key performance indicator. It's about 3 generations of how do we support that child in utero, that grandchild in utero. It's really, I think, a really powerful concept when we really get our head around what epigenetics means. And now there is a new group of people who have gathered around this, and it's called DOHAD, the Developmental Origins of Health and Disease, looking at what's happening at the very early age. So don't just look at preventing adult disease with adults. We need to go right back, and we need to be starting this prevention and focusing and seeing as precious all of the generations that begin in utero and preconception indeed. Now, the beginning person, if you like, who started the DOHAD concept was a doctor in the UK, in England, Barker, and this was his hypothesis, and that he was able to get wonderful notes, which had been written by the midwife, may I say, about the birth weight of babies. And the birth weight was connected to coronary heart disease in adulthood. So that is only the beginning now of what we're beginning to understand of the importance of these significant factors. So if you don't know your birth weight, it's important you know your birth weight, and it's important that people document all of the things that happened in utero, in neonatal period, and in the early years, because I think it's only going to explode as to the importance of this time for you to be able to know what might be happening to you as an adult, not only physically, but of course mental health and emotionally and in every way. So this is just one study. I'd say that Barker probably began this whole concept. If you think my first slide when we were looking at adult origins of disease beginning in childhood and adolescence, and now we've come back to it being much earlier than that. And I don't know how we didn't think that, like obviously that is what it should have been, but it is actually a new concept that this is important, this whole new concept of DOHAD. So how have we acknowledged this at a policy and planning level? I'm very excited about the fact that Australia has the early development census. In that, in the first year of school, throughout every school in Australia, there is an assessment done of a child's development. So we get population to the level of postcode results on the different domains of a child's development, so that we can make some policy and planning decisions as a result of that. So the AEDC, it's once again a wonderful website, but I think it's, you know, if I thought 20 years ago that we would be able to get something like this happening, I wouldn't have thought it possible. And the reason why it's happening is because this science is being grasped, and we're doing and making significant changes as a result of it. And in New South Wales Health, our policy framework is also acknowledging this, in that we, as you can see, that we're looking at preconception, pregnancy, infant. So we're looking at what kind of interventions, what kind of services do we need to have in New South Wales for ensuring that adults are healthy, safe and well. So that's our life course approach to policy. So in conclusion, I'd just like to say that this has been an exciting time to be involved in health. It's not often that in your clinical lifetime you get this really superb detailed explanation with pictures, if you like, because it's not really different from Bowlby, which I did learn about as a medical student, the importance of attachment, but now we've got brain pictures to prove it, so of course doctors are more interested. Sorry, I didn't say that. But I think some of what I've said might touch on people individually. What I'm talking about here are big population issues. Risk is not destiny, and please don't be like me. I found out about the importance of the first 3 years when my son was 4. So don't take anything personally. Everything about this is about population, big ticket items. And however, at a population level, I think that this could not be more interesting or more important science, and that we all have a responsibility in this room to act on it. Thank you.